Al Capone didn't become America's most famous criminal by hiding from the law. He became famous because the law knew exactly what he was and still couldn't touch him. In the middle of Prohibition, while violence spread quietly across cities, Capone lived openly. He attended charity events. He posed for photographers. His name appeared in newspapers again and again, not as a suspect, but as a spectacle. And every time his face appeared in print, the system treated him less like a threat. The public recognized him before they feared him. The media turned him into a character, and prosecutors hesitated, unsure whether to prosecute a man the country was already watching like entertainment. Capone understood something early. Visibility doesn't expose you if people stop believing what they see. While the country watched, investigations stalled. Jurisdictions clashed, responsibility blurred. This isn't the story of how Al Capone became violent. It's the story of how he became untouchable, by making fame itself the crime scene. Before Al Capone became untouchable, he had to become visible. This wasn't an accident, and it wasn't reckless. It was a calculated inversion of how criminals were supposed to operate. While other organized crime figures worked in shadows, Capone walked into daylight. While they avoided cameras, he posed for them. While they silenced witnesses, he gave interviews. And the more visible he became, the harder he was to prosecute. This is the story of how fame became a weapon, how attention became armor, and how the American legal system, designed to contain threats, found itself paralyzed by a man who refused to hide. When Prohibition began in 1920, it created a problem larger than lawmakers anticipated. The 18th Amendment didn't just ban alcohol. It created a massive underground economy overnight. Speakeasies emerged on every street corner. Bootlegging routes stretched from Canada to Mexico. Distribution networks sprawled across state lines, and the territorial violence required to control them turned cities into war zones. By 1925, Chicago had become the epicenter of this economy. The city's geographic position made it a natural hub. Its political corruption made it permissive, and its massive population made it profitable. Within that economy, Al Capone was rising fast, but Capone didn't rise the way his predecessors had. Johnny Torrio, his mentor, operated quietly. Other crime bosses maintained low profiles. They understood that anonymity was protection, that invisibility was survival. Capone rejected that entirely. Instead, he did something that seemed suicidal for a criminal. He made himself famous, deliberately, systematically, with the same strategic calculation he applied to territorial expansion and revenue streams. In 1925, Capone began appearing at public events, boxing matches at Chicago Stadium, theater openings on State Street, charity fundraisers at prominent hotels. He wore expensive suits, tailored on Michigan Avenue. He tipped bartenders $50 bills. He shook hands with aldermen, businessmen, ward bosses, and reporters who followed him everywhere. And every time he appeared, photographers followed. This wasn't vanity. It was strategy. Capone understood something about the American legal system that most criminals missed. The system wasn't designed to prosecute celebrities. It was designed to prosecute criminals who looked like criminals. Men who skulked in alleys, who avoided attention, who fit the public imagination of what danger looked like. And Capone was systematically making himself look like something else. He donated to charities, not quietly through intermediaries, but publicly, with his name attached. When the Depression began to take hold in the late 20s, before the crash fully devastated the economy, Capone opened soup kitchens. He fed the unemployed. He made sure reporters were present to document his generosity. He gave interviews where he positioned himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman providing a service people wanted. In one widely circulated interview, Capone said, "I make my money by supplying a public demand. If I break the law, my customers who patronize my places of business are as guilty as I am." The only difference is they aren't called criminals. This wasn't a defense. It was a reframing. Capone wasn't asking for sympathy. He was asking a question the legal system wasn't prepared to answer. If millions of Americans are breaking this law every weekend, who exactly is the criminal? The supplier or the society that created the demand? And the more he asked that question in public, the more complicated his prosecution became. He appeared in newspapers, not in crime reports, but in society pages. His name appeared alongside legitimate businessmen. His donations were listed next to those of bankers and industrialists. He attended the same events as city officials. And slowly, imperceptibly, the public began to process him differently. Not as a threat to be eliminated, but as a figure to be understood. A character, a symbol of something larger than himself. This transformation wasn't accidental. Capone cultivated relationships with reporters. He gave them access. He provided quotes. He made their jobs easier. And in return, they wrote about him not as a monster, but as a phenomenon. Some articles were critical, certainly. They called him a gangster. They detailed his criminal empire. But even the critical pieces framed him as larger than life, as someone worth reading about, worth thinking about, worth debating. And that debate, that cultural conversation about who Capone was and what he represented, became a shield. Because once the public is debating your significance, prosecuting you becomes complicated. It's no longer just a legal question. It's a cultural one. And cultural questions don't have clean answers. Capone didn't invent this strategy, but he perfected it. He understood that in a democracy where public opinion matters, where juries are drawn from the population, where politicians are elected by voters, perception isn't secondary to reality. Perception is reality. And he spent years constructing a perception that made prosecution nearly impossible. Visibility created a specific kind of problem for prosecutors. It wasn't that they didn't know Capone was guilty. They knew. Everyone knew. The evidence of his criminal enterprise was everywhere. The bodies, the violence, the speakeasies operating openly under his protection, the payoffs to police officers and politicians. But knowing and proving are different things, and Capone's fame made proof exponentially harder to gather. Here's why. In a normal, organized crime investigation, prosecutors rely on witnesses, testimonies from people on the inside, paper trails that connect criminal activity to specific individuals, evidence collected quietly, often over years, from people willing to cooperate, in exchange for protection or reduced sentences. But when a criminal becomes a public figure, those dynamics change fundamentally. Witnesses became afraid to testify, not just because of physical threats, though those existed, but because Capone had public support. Testifying against him wasn't just dangerous, it was unpopular. It meant standing against a man who fed the hungry, who employed thousands, who represented resistance to a law most Chicagoans despised. In several cases, witnesses recanted their testimony. They claimed they were mistaken, that they had been confused, that they couldn't be certain of what they'd seen. In other cases, witnesses simply disappeared. Not killed, necessarily, though that happened too. Just gone. Relocated to other cities, unwilling to participate, suddenly unreachable. And even when evidence existed, even when witnesses held firm, juries hesitated. Capone's lawyers were among the best in Chicago. They weren't public defenders scrambling with inadequate resources. They were elite attorneys who understood how to manipulate public perception, how to exploit technical loopholes, how to create reasonable doubt even when guilt seemed obvious. They didn't just defend him, they reframed him. They reminded juries that prohibition itself was unpopular, that it was an overreach of government power, that millions of Americans broke this law regularly without consequence, that Capone was being targeted not because he was uniquely guilty, but because he was visible, and juries, drawn from a public that largely opposed prohibition, often agreed. Between 1925 and 1930, multiple attempts were made to prosecute Capone for carrying concealed weapons, for violating the Volstead Act, which enforced prohibition, for conspiracy to violate federal law, for ordering violence against rivals. None of them stuck. Not because the evidence was weak. The evidence was often overwhelming, but because the system couldn't reconcile what Capone was with what he appeared to be. He didn't look like a threat. He looked like a businessman the government was bullying. He looked like a man being punished for succeeding in an economy the public had created through demand. And that perception, carefully constructed through years of public appearances, charitable donations, and media cultivation, became a form of immunity. Prosecutors knew they were facing an uphill battle. They knew that bringing charges against Capone and losing would be worse than not bringing charges at all. It would demonstrate impotence. It would embolden him and other criminals. It would make the legal system look weak. So they hesitated. They waited for perfect evidence, for witnesses who couldn't be intimidated, for cases that couldn't fail. And while they waited, Capone continued operating, expanding, consolidating power. The confusion wasn't just legal, it was psychological. Capone had created a situation where the system knew he was guilty but couldn't act decisively, where movement in any direction carried enormous risk, and in that paralysis, he thrived. Fame did something else. It fractured responsibility. In Chicago during the 1920s, law enforcement wasn't unified. It was divided, overlapping, often competitive. The Chicago Police Department handled local crime. The Cook County Sheriff had jurisdiction over the county. The Illinois State Police operated statewide. Federal prohibition agents enforced the Volstead Act, and the Bureau of Investigation, which would later become the FBI, was still in its early formation, trying to establish federal authority over crimes that crossed state lines. Each agency had overlapping jurisdiction. Each had different priorities. Each operated under different political pressures, and none of them wanted to take the risk of prosecuting Capone and failing. This created a cycle of institutional paralysis. Local police assumed federal agents would handle it. They argued that bootlegging was a federal crime, that prohibition enforcement was a federal responsibility. Federal agents assumed local police had more immediate evidence. They argued that murder, extortion, and violence were local crimes, that they fell under city and state jurisdiction. State investigators waited for someone else to move first. They didn't want to commit resources to a case that might be taken over by federal authorities or undermined by corrupt local officials. And while they waited, while they debated jurisdiction and responsibility, Capone operated. Internal memos from this period reveal the problem clearly. In 1927, a young prohibition agent named Elliot Ness wrote in a report, "Capone operates openly because no single agency is willing to commit resources to a case this public. Failure would be visible. Success would be shared. The incentive structure discourages action." That line is critical. Failure would be visible. Capone's fame meant that any prosecutor who went after him and lost wouldn't just lose a case. They'd lose credibility. They'd become a public example of governmental impotence. They'd be the person who tried to take down America's most famous criminal and failed. That failure would follow them for the rest of their career. So they didn't try. This wasn't cowardice. It was rational calculation. Prosecuting Capone required perfect evidence, cooperative witnesses who couldn't be intimidated or killed, a jury willing to convict despite his public support, a judge who wouldn't be swayed by political pressure. And even then, his legal team was good enough to create reasonable doubt, to exploit procedural technicalities, to delay proceedings indefinitely. The risk was enormous. The reward, split among multiple agencies, diluted by shared credit, was minimal. So each agency waited for another to move first, and Capone continued appearing in newspapers, attending public events, shaking hands with politicians who privately despised him but publicly tolerated him because he was popular with voters. He wasn't hiding. He was daring them to act, and the longer they hesitated, the more untouchable he became. The jurisdictional fragmentation wasn't just about bureaucracy. It was about fear. Fear of failure, fear of embarrassment, fear of what would happen if they acted and lost. And Capone exploited that fear ruthlessly. He made himself so visible, so public, so integrated into Chicago's social fabric that removing him seemed impossible without causing systemic disruption. He employed thousands of people, directly and indirectly. Bartenders, drivers, enforcers, accountants, lawyers, suppliers, distributors, all of them dependent on his operation for income. He paid off police officers, not all of them, but enough. He provided campaign contributions to aldermen and judges. He attended fundraisers. He made himself useful to people in power, and he did all of this openly. Not hidden, not secret, just normalized. By 1929, prosecuting Capone felt less like enforcing the law and more like attacking a Chicago institution, and no single agency wanted to be responsible for the consequences of that attack. So they waited and debated and passed responsibility and hoped someone else would act first. The media didn't just report on Capone, they created him. Between 1925 and 1931, Capone appeared in hundreds of newspaper articles. Thousands if you count every mention, every photograph, every editorial cartoon. He was covered in local Chicago papers, national magazines, wire service reports that spread his story across the country. Some coverage was critical. Newspapers called him a gangster, a menace, a symbol of lawlessness. They detailed the violence of his organization, the murders, the bombings, the intimidation. But even the critical coverage was fascinated. It treated him as a figure worth understanding, worth analyzing, worth debating. And the more they covered him, the more complicated his prosecution became. Here's the mechanism. When someone is famous, the public begins to feel like they know them. They form opinions, they take sides, they develop narratives that explain who this person is and what they represent. For Capone, that narrative wasn't simply dangerous criminal. It was more complex, more contradictory. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also generous. He fed the hungry. He employed thousands. He represented rebellion against an unpopular law. He was self-made. He came from poverty and built an empire. He was charismatic, quotable, interesting. Editorial cartoons depicted him as a symbol, sometimes of corruption, sometimes of rebellion, sometimes of the contradiction between legal morality and popular desire, but always as a figure larger than an ordinary criminal. And once that transformation happened, prosecuting him wasn't just a legal question, it was a cultural one. Judges read those newspapers. They saw the cartoons. They understood that Capone wasn't just a defendant. He was a phenomenon. And sentencing a phenomenon carries different weight than sentencing a criminal. Juries read the papers too. They saw the photographs of Capone at charity events. They read about the soup kitchens. They knew about his donations. They lived in a city where everyone drank illegally, where speakeasies were as common as grocery stores, where prohibition was viewed not as moral law, but as governmental overreach. And when they sat in that jury box, they weren't just deciding guilt or innocence. They were deciding whether to punish a man for doing what millions of people wanted him to do. Prosecutors read those papers too, and they knew that public opinion mattered, that juries could be swayed, that even with perfect evidence, conviction wasn't guaranteed. In 1929, a reporter asked Capone how he felt about being called public enemy number one by the Chicago Crime Commission. Capone smiled and said, "Public service is my motto. I've always regarded it as a public benefaction if people are given what they want." That response appeared in newspapers across the country. Not as a confession, as a punchline, as evidence of his charisma, his wit, his ability to reframe criminality as entrepreneurship. The media had turned his criminality into theater. And once that happened, the legal system struggled to treat him seriously. Courtroom sketch artists drew him. Not with menace, but with detail. With attention to his expensive suit, his confident posture, his calm expression. He looked like a man in control, not of crime necessarily, but of the situation, of the room, of the narrative. And that appearance mattered more than evidence. Because juries don't just evaluate facts, they evaluate people. They make judgments about character, about whether someone seems guilty, about whether punishment seems proportionate. And Capone, through years of careful media cultivation, had made himself seem like someone who didn't deserve punishment, or at least not the kind of punishment reserved for dangerous criminals. This is the danger of visibility when wielded strategically. It doesn't just expose, it transforms. Capone wasn't hiding from accountability. He was using attention to redefine what accountability meant, to shift the conversation from "did he commit crimes" to "what do we do about a criminal this popular?" And for years, the answer was nothing. The media amplified his power not through support, necessarily, but through attention. Every article made him more famous. Every photograph made him more recognizable. Every mention reinforced the idea that he was someone worth discussing. And discussion creates hesitation. It creates debate. It creates the sense that action requires consensus. Capone didn't need the media to like him. He just needed them to keep talking about him, to keep showing his face, to keep reinforcing the idea that he was more than a criminal. He was a story, a character, a symbol, and symbols are much harder to prosecute than people. By 1930, the federal government realized they had a problem. Capone wasn't just a Chicago issue. He was a national embarrassment. He represented everything Prohibition was supposed to eliminate: organized crime, violence, corruption. And yet he operated openly, attended public events, and appeared in newspapers as if he were a legitimate businessman. Which, functionally, he was. He ran an empire. He employed thousands. He generated millions in revenue. The fact that his empire was illegal didn't change its structure or sophistication. President Herbert Hoover made Capone a priority, not because Capone was the most dangerous criminal in America, but because he was the most visible. He made the government look weak, ineffective, unable to enforce its own laws. So the federal government changed tactics. If they couldn't prosecute him for his crimes, murder, bootlegging, racketeering, they would prosecute him for something else: taxes. This wasn't novel. The Internal Revenue Service had used tax evasion charges before. The Revenue Act of 1913 established that all income, regardless of source, was taxable. That meant illegal income. Criminal proceeds. Money from bootlegging, gambling, prostitution. If you made money, you owed taxes, even if that money came from crime. But prosecuting tax evasion against someone as visible as Capone was unprecedented. It required proving not just that he earned money, but how much, and that he deliberately failed to report it. The Treasury Department assembled a team, not just investigators, but forensic accountants, people who could trace money through complex networks of cash transactions, front businesses, and intermediaries. Their job wasn't to prove Capone was a criminal in the traditional sense. It was to prove he earned money he didn't declare. And because Capone had been so visible, buying expensive suits, tipping lavishly, donating publicly, purchasing real estate, there was a clear record of wealth. This is where visibility finally became a liability. Capone's fame meant his spending was documented, photographed, written about. He couldn't claim poverty. The evidence of his wealth was everywhere, in newspapers, in photographs, in public records of property purchases. The Treasury team spent months reconstructing his finances. They interviewed tailors who made his suits, hotel managers who recorded his stays, real estate agents who sold him property, accountants who handled transactions for his front businesses. They built a case not from witnesses who could be intimidated, but from documents, receipts, invoices, financial records that couldn't be threatened or bribed into silence. In June 1931, the federal government indicted Capone on 22 counts of tax evasion. Not murder, not bootlegging, not racketeering, taxes. The trial began in October 1931. Capone arrived confident. His lawyers attempted the same strategies that had worked before. They argued he was being targeted unfairly. That other wealthy men avoided taxes too through legal loopholes and creative accounting. That the government was prosecuting him because he was famous, not because he was uniquely guilty. But this time, the prosecution had something different. Not witnesses who could be intimidated. Not circumstantial evidence that could be explained away. Not vague accusations that required juries to make moral judgments. Numbers, documents, financial records that told a clear story. The prosecution presented photographs of Capone at expensive hotels, receipts from tailors on Michigan Avenue, records of real estate purchases in Florida and Chicago, testimony from accountants who confirmed he never filed tax returns matching his spending. They showed that between 1924 and 1929, Capone spent over $165,000 on personal expenses alone. Adjusted for inflation, that's millions in today's currency, and he never reported any income. Capone's lawyers argued that much of this spending was from winnings at racetracks, that he was a successful gambler, that his lifestyle was funded by luck, not crime. The prosecution demolished that defense. They showed that the amounts were too consistent, too large, that no gambler wins that reliably, that his wealth clearly came from his business operations, which everyone knew existed, even if they couldn't prove individual crimes. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. On October 17, 1931, they returned a verdict. Guilty on 5 counts of tax evasion. The courtroom went silent. For years, Capone had seemed untouchable, and now a jury of 12 ordinary citizens had convicted him. The judge sentenced him to 11 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for tax evasion at that time. It was a message, a demonstration that even the most famous, the most protected, the most seemingly untouchable criminal could be brought down. Capone was transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. Later, he was moved to Alcatraz, the new maximum security prison in San Francisco Bay, designed specifically for criminals who had corrupted other prisons through bribery and intimidation. And just like that, the man who had used fame as armor was removed from public view. So what actually happened here? Capone didn't fail because he became visible. He succeeded for years because of visibility. Fame protected him. It confused the system. It slowed investigations. It made witnesses hesitate. It fractured responsibility across jurisdictions. It created public sympathy that made juries reluctant to convict. But eventually, the federal government found a method that didn't require witnesses or juries sympathetic to prohibition. They found a crime that could be proven with documents, and documents don't get intimidated. They don't recant. They don't disappear. This reveals something critical about how power actually works. Visibility protects you when the system isn't sure how to respond, when norms are unclear, when responsibility is divided, when public opinion is conflicted. But once the system decides on a method and commits resources to it, visibility becomes evidence. Every photograph of Capone in an expensive suit became proof of income. Every newspaper article about his donations became proof of wealth. Every public appearance became documentation of a lifestyle that required money he never reported. Capone understood this too late. He built fame thinking it would make him untouchable. And for nearly a decade, it did. But fame is only armor as long as the system remains confused. Once it focuses, fame becomes a record. A trail. Evidence. By the time Capone was released from prison in 1939, he was no longer famous. Not in the way he had been. He was sick. The untreated syphilis he had contracted years earlier had progressed. It had damaged his brain, left him diminished, confused, no longer capable of running an empire or even understanding what had happened to him. He lived quietly in Florida, at his estate in Palm Island. He avoided cameras, rarely appeared in public. The man who had once courted attention now hid from it. He died in 1947. Not as a criminal, not as a celebrity, just as a man the world had mostly forgotten. But the mechanism he used, the way he weaponized visibility, didn't die with him. It's been replicated, refined, used by criminals, politicians, and public figures ever since. Because Capone proved something dangerous. That fame doesn't just change how people see you. It changes how institutions respond to you. And if you can control that response long enough, if you can create enough confusion, enough debate, enough hesitation, you can operate in plain sight. Not forever. Nothing lasts forever. But long enough to build an empire. Long enough to become untouchable. Long enough to make the system question whether it even knows how to stop you. Al Capone became America's most famous criminal not by hiding from the law, but by making the law. Hesitate. He used visibility as a tool, attention as a delay mechanism, fame as a form of institutional paralysis. And for years, it worked. Not because he was smarter than the system, but because the system wasn't designed to handle someone who refused to act like a criminal. Fame didn't make him innocent. It made him complicated. And in that complication, he found years of freedom. The law eventually caught him, but not before he showed the world something unsettling. That visibility in the right hands isn't exposure. It's camouflage.